it's still the first month of the new year, and I always like to focus on change and new discoveries in January. So today my talk title is taken from something that our co-founder Charles Fillmore is often quoted as saying. He said, "I reserve the right to change my mind." Seems like such a simple and obvious thing, like, well, duh, yeah, anybody can change their mind. In fact, in honor of David Bowie's passing this week, I was thinking about changing the title to Reserving the Right to Change Your Mind. But he will be missed. He will be missed. And changes are a part of life, and if we don't change our minds, or at least if we're not willing to change our minds, things can get messy. The basic idea that Charles Fillmore was trying to get across here is that he didn't want anyone thinking that his ideas were etched in stone. Charles did believe that there is such a thing as absolute truth, but he also knew that there is no such thing as perfect or complete human understanding of that truth. Therefore, he reserved the right to change his mind as new information and new knowledge and new evidence became available. And that was one of the things that initially attracted me to unity. That's one of the things I really admired about the unity message, because all of the other spiritual traditions that I was familiar with growing up were not all that amenable to change, if you know what I mean. They were mainly the traditional Christian religions. They seemed to have a real problem with change, which I find rather strange, because that book, the Bible, is built on a tradition of rebels and rabble-rousers. Think about it. The Old Testament prophets, a whole bunch of them, they were constantly calling out the authorities for oppression, injustice, and demanding change, demanding reforms. Jesus got himself killed. Got himself killed for resisting the status quo. And yet, despite that tradition of stirring up change, it seemed to me that most of the churches I was familiar with spent an overwhelming amount of time resisting and fighting change. Churches had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century on just about every issue that we take for granted today, including those having to do with civil rights and justice. And then Charles Fillmore comes along, and it's like a breath of fresh air. He says, "I reserve the right to change my mind," which I heard as an expression of humility. The exact opposite of a know-it-all or a spiritual guru who expects people to accept everything they say without any questions. I've heard that people who studied under Charles Fillmore talk about how Charles was always more interested in hearing your ideas about something he may have written than hearing you parrot it back to him. Or maybe a better term for it would be regurgitated back to him. You know, there's that idea that people think that, you know, we're supposed to parrot this stuff back and forth. He wanted to know what you thought about it and whether you had any variations, what your understanding of it was. Now, 2 years ago, back in 2014, there was a famous debate which illustrates this idea of changing versus not changing. It happened to be a debate on creationism that featured these two guys, Bill Nye and Ken Ham. Now, Bill Nye, he's the science guy. He spoke for evolution. Ken Ham spoke for creationism, or more specifically, what they call the young Earth theory of creationism, which says that the earth is about 6,000 years old and human beings were created exactly the way they say it was in the book of Genesis. And it's hard to believe that we're still having this debate today, but there it is. And the fact of the matter is that there are still a lot of preachers and more than a few prominent politicians who think the book of Genesis should be taught in science class alongside Newton and Darwin. Okay, it's still there. So at the end of this debate, a member of the audience had a brilliant and simple question for the speakers. And the question was this: what, if anything, would make you change your mind? Bill Nye, the science guy, as you might expect, said, evidence. Show me the evidence, and he would change his mind on evolution and the Big Bang. Ken Ham said, nothing would change his mind. He said, I'm a Christian, and nothing would ever convince him that the Bible was not literally true. Perfect illustration of the glaring difference between being open-minded and closed-minded, between humility and hubris. Can you imagine what the world would be like today if we didn't reserve the right to change our minds? It's almost like it's the necessity of changing our minds. And once again, it was another major figure in Christian history who said that we should be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That was Paul. What would the world be like today for women? Consider this. What would the world be like today for women if people didn't change their minds? No job, no working outside the home, right? No property ownership, no vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. It was finally ratified in 1920. Doesn't seem all that long ago, does it? It came down to the state of Tennessee to put it over the top. And that state legislature was divided evenly, 48 in favor, 48 against this amendment. And that meant that it wasn't going to pass. That meant the 19th Amendment would go back for another round, except for one thing: the guy who changed his mind. This guy. His name was Harry Byrne. At 24, he was the youngest member of the Tennessee state legislature. On the day of the vote, he was wearing a red rose in his lapel, which signified that he was part of the gang that was going to be voting against the amendment. Everybody who was voting for the amendment wore a yellow rose in their lapel. 48 to 48, evenly divided, and he was ready to vote against the amendment. And then he received a letter from his mother. This is great. Here's part of the letter. She says, "Dear son, hurrah! Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. Signed, your mother." So, still wearing his red rose with the note from his mom in his pocket, Harry voted in favor of ratifying the 19th Amendment. And then he had to go into hiding for a while. But the rest is history, as they say. And the Mrs. Cat up there, by the way, Mrs. Cat was a reference to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a major leader in the suffrage movement. Be a good boy, Harry. I love it. The moral of the story is that words are powerful. Don't be afraid to speak up and ask for what you want. Don't be afraid to speak up and speak out for justice. And you don't have to threaten or be a bully either. I know there wasn't much in the way of guilt there except for that be a good boy thing. But we don't have to threaten, we don't have to bully. Get up and ask for what we want. Where would the world be if she hadn't written that letter to her son asking him to vote in favor of suffrage? You never know what kind of positive effect your words might have. And I know some folks will say, okay, well, if the amendment wasn't passed then, it would have been eventually passed. And that's probably true. But you know what? It's not good enough. A legal maxim that I learned in my prior profession, which I believe in wholeheartedly, says that justice delayed is justice denied. Justice delayed is justice denied. And tomorrow we're going to commemorate the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That's something that he used to say. He used a variation on that theme in his letter from the Birmingham jail, where he wrote, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied." Think about what life would be like for African American people if other people did not reserve the right to actively undertake the effort to change their minds. It took 100 years to go from slavery to segregation, lynching, Jim Crow laws, and finally to full recognition of civil rights. It took 100 years. People had to keep changing their minds over and over and over again. And even so, racism hasn't quite gone away in this country. It's gone underground maybe, or might be more accurate to say that it's crawled under a rock where it still hides, and from time to time something or someone comes along and turns the rock over and we see it crawl out again. It's still there, but it's good at hiding. That's why we have to be willing to keep changing our minds over and over and over again. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is this one, which you can also find in his letter from a Birmingham jail. These are some beautiful words of hope and optimism, where he says, "When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember that there is a creative force in this universe working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil, a power that is able to make a way out of no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Dr. King was a Baptist minister. He was Christian through and through, and yet he managed to communicate and be amazingly persuasive and inspirational without bombarding you with Bible passages and religious language. Instead of God, he says creative force, which is a concept we discussed here a couple of weeks ago. Creative force, creation. Can you have creation without change? It's impossible. You can't create without changing something. The creative process, change is inherent in the creative process. This whole concept of the moral arc, that was something that Dr. King borrowed from Theodore Parker. He was a Unitarian minister and an abolitionist who died back in 1860, which was just at the start of the Civil War. Someone recently wrote a book, an entire book, about this idea of the moral arc. And the book starts with these words: "The metaphor of the bending moral arc symbolizes what may be the most important and least appreciated trend in human history: moral progress." Moral progress. And least appreciated is right. Least appreciated is right, because it seems like when every election cycle comes around, there's this chorus of voices telling us we need to go back, right? Go back to some magical and non-existent time when men were men and women knew their places and everything was perfect. Usually sometime in the 50s, right? Which was when lunch counters were still segregated and the top marginal tax rate was something like, what, 90%? You know, yeah. Voices like Dr. King urge us to keep moving forward, not going backwards. Moving forward to cooperate with the creative force of the universe, to be patient but not complacent, and to bend along with that moral arc, which takes change. Despite everything that Dr. King had been through, the challenges that he was sure were coming, he was optimistic. He was optimistic about the future while still being realistic about the present. He was realistic because, as he said in that beautiful quote before, our days do in fact become dreary at times. And those are the times when we have to be able to focus on that creative force that is the very fabric of the universe, and learn how to align with it. Learn how to cooperate with it, to trust it, and to move with it, knowing that it bends towards justice. It's not about reaching some destination in the future where everything is perfect. People will try to sell you that fantasy world where everything is someday going to be perfect. The word for that is utopia. And it's that kind of thinking that leads to disillusionment and cynicism, because perfection isn't possible. Perfection is not possible. A better way to describe the process we're talking about here, a new word I just learned, protopia. Instead of utopia, it's about protopia, steady and incremental improvement where the goal is not perfection, but to make the world a slightly better place tomorrow than it was yesterday. That all starts with changing our minds. It starts with reserving the right to change our minds and then to exercise that right. Are we optimistic or pessimistic? Do we feel the need to respond to violence with more violence? Or might there perhaps be another way to respond? The only way that creative force can work in this human-filled world is through the creative power of human consciousness that Theodore Parker, Charles Fillmore, and Martin Luther King Jr. and many others have demonstrated. The consciousness they represent believes in optimism rather than pessimism, hope rather than despair, knowledge instead of ignorance, and so on. But it's more than just identifying pairs of opposites and picking one or the other. We have to work to understand the broad range of ideas and behavior that span between the extremes, instead of just settling for rigid categories and frozen ideology. Being willing to change our mind means we have to be a little more nimble-minded than perhaps our culture is used to. And that's a challenge. That's not easy. That's the challenge that they leave for us to take up, and nobody said that it would be easy. However, it is the only way that great things are accomplished. And the great news is that we get to be a part of that process if we're willing to take up the challenge. See you next week.